Welcome, everyone. Breaking news for all of you aware of what's going on. Recent inscription was published claiming to be one of the oldest Hebrew inscriptions ever, claiming to have the divine name, the God of Israel, on it. And we're going to talk about today. So I have a scholar here joining me, Dr. David Schreiner. David, thanks for joining me on my channel today. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, and thanks for having me. Good topic to have a conversation about.
Absolutely. So those who don't know, about a year ago, Associates for Biblical Research claimed they found a tiny little curse tablet that dates to, they claim, late Bronze Age 2A, I believe. So that's around 1400 to 1300, somewhere in there. They claim they found it on Mount Ebal, which is mentioned in Joshua 8. It talks about an altar Joshua built up there. Now, that altar was found by Adam Zertal, I think about a few decades ago, and dated it to about the time of that most scholars believe that Joshua's conquest was taking place, towards the year 1200 BC, sometime around there, a little bit before then. So Associates for Biblical Research, which is kind of an ultra-conservative group, went back there, looked through some film, and claimed they found this little amulet, this little curse tablet that mentions the name Adonai, the divine name. I'm not going to say it because I've had some Orthodox Jews ask me to stop saying it, so I'm not going to say it. But so this broke recently. They announced it a year ago. It was just published, and we saw the paper, and we have a lot of concerns. I've been talking to Dr. Schreiner here about bringing him on my channel to talk about his recent book he published, which we're going to get to in a little bit. But I thought this would be the perfect opportunity to bring him on and talk about this new recent find here. So, Dr. Schreiner, tell us a little bit about yourself. Tell us about your background, and then we'll get into this this recent discovery that was just published.
Yeah, so I'm Dr. David Schreiner, and I work at a Wesleyan seminary. It's in the Wesleyan Armenian tradition in the Jackson metro area in Jackson, Mississippi. It's Wesley Biblical Seminary. I'm the associate professor of Old Testament there, so I teach a lot of Old Testament courses, a large swath of Old Testament courses. And then I'm also the associate dean there. I have been on field digs, and so I do have some experience in archaeology. I know the nuts and bolts. I know how this works. So when I listened to the press conference and heard some of the things that they were claiming, a lot of this stuff kind of resonated. In a previous book, I actually had a chapter devoted to Mount Ebal. It's a very, very fascinating site. It's a site that I think is really important to understand for people who tend to have a high view of Scripture and are want to ask some serious questions about the historical veracity behind Scripture as well. So it's a very good site. It's a very fascinating site. It's a very important site. But as we'll talk about, I have a lot of questions about this find that go all the way back a year ago when they initially presented it, how they presented it, and those types of things. And then when the article was published on May 12th, those questions persisted and new questions arose. So yeah, that's a little bit about myself. Full disclosure, I don't claim to be, I didn't get my PhD in archaeology. I got my PhD in biblical studies from Asbury Theological Seminary. But I have been on field digs. I've done stuff. I've actually found some inscriptions myself. So I know how this game is played.
Yeah, I think that's fascinating, and I appreciate you coming on talking about it, because I wanted to jump on this pretty quickly before a lot of Christians run with this, may fall for it, take this sort of sensationalist route. And I think we as Christians need to do our best to hold to what is true, follow the evidence where it leads, and not just go along with evidence that we might find useful. You know, people have announced they found the tomb of Joseph from Egypt. And sure, that would be great, but we shouldn't just believe anything just because we hear it. So let's pull up the paper here. Just want to put this up here so people can see it here. Here's the recent paper that was published. And what do you want to talk about with this? What do you want me to show the actual
well, let's talk about. Let's before you get into that, let's kind of revisit kind of how this kind of unfolded, and then let's talk really quickly about the journal itself, because I think there's some interesting questions raised about the journal itself. So rewind about a year ago. The Scott Stripling and company came out with a press conference, basically telling everybody that would listen to them what they found. Normally, the standard timeline of things is that you submit your research to a peer review journal, you let them do the peer review editing process, and then you come out with a press release. So it was very weird, for lack of a better term, to kind of invert the timeline. So they initially came out with a press release, told everybody what they found, didn't release but a few pictures, and said, you're just going to have to wait. This stuff is in the peer review process. Now, that raised a lot of flags and a lot of concerns. And in the process of this press release, they made some really widespread claims to the extent of actually questioning the legitimacy of any conversation about the Deuteronomistic, the documentary hypothesis, to securing beyond all shadow of a doubt an early date of the Exodus, and a lot of other things which were built upon a very sophisticated arguments. And so it was very difficult to see how one find, as interesting as it was going to kind of turn everything on its head. And so a lot of problems with that. And a lot of scholars who were trained epigraphers, trained archaeologists, trained biblical scholars started asking a lot of questions. Now, fast forward to now, they have kind of clarified, and purportedly one of the reasons why Scott Strickland said is that one of the reasons why they inverted the order of things was they claimed that they were going to be usurped by some people leaking pictures out on the internet, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, take it for what it's worth. We'll take them, and that's fine. I mean, that could very well have happened. But the article is out now. And the first thing that I thought when I saw it was, what in the world is Heritage Science? That's the name of the journal. I've never heard of it. I've never heard of this. Now, I did some digging, and I asked some people on Twitter, what is this journal? Because I was expecting to see this article in certain journals that are widely recognized to be at the top of the field. I knew there was tomographic scans involved with their argumentation. I knew there was a lot of computer regeneration involved with this. So I knew it wasn't just a straightforward biblical studies archaeology argument. That being said, I still had no clue what Heritage Science was. So we, digging, looking around the internet and kind of talking to some people on Twitter, apparently Heritage Science is a rather reputable journal. However, there's a lot of conversation about whether or not this article should have even made it through the peer review process, because this article apparently deals with the materiality of cultural objects. Basically, it studies the stuff that the cultural object was produced from. Now, they make a big deal about this being a lead tablet, and there's a sizable. That's my kid in the background. I see that. Don't worry. Don't worry. There's a sizable element in the article that talks about where the lead is from. And so maybe that was the inroads to get into this journal. That being said, this is an epigraphic argument. That is to say, this is an argument based on that rises and falls by what is said, how it is written, and gaining meaning from what is purportedly written on this. So it's not really an argument that rises and falls on the lead, the material that the supposed curse tablet is written on. It's an argument on it's an epigraphic argument. So that being said, it's really hard to figure out how an epigraphic argument made it through Heritage Science in their peer review process. And of course, if you go on the Facebook page of Peter Gert Vanderveen, he goes at length to kind of talk about this. So that was one of my initial questions. All that being said, look, a good argument is a good argument. The problem is that this isn't a very good argument. So, we can sit here and say, what is Heritage Science as a journal? But, that will only take us so far. The reality is do they make a good argument? And that's really where in my opinion, there's some problematic things going on.
So just to update everyone, this is the tablet we are talking about right here. This is the little, I believe the hero sizes, so you can see at the bottom here, maybe that's 3.5 millimeters. This is a very small tablet. They claim they found this on Mount Ebal. So this is the altar that dates back to around the year 1200 BC that would align with the account we see in Joshua about them building an altar up on there. So here's that. And they claim they found this little thing in, I believe it was fill that Adams Ortel sort of dug out.
It's a discard pile is eventually what it is. So on an archaeology dig, you're just moving dirt in a lot of instances, and so you one of the things that you do is that you scoop dirt into a bucket. You take those buckets and you put it in a pile. So eventually you have these discard piles, which is basically exactly what it sounds like, discarded dirt. Now, what Scott Stripling did and what he employed at Mount Ebal, which he apparently used at other sites, was this process called wet sifting. So the dirt goes onto this metal grate, and basically you just shake the grate until all the dirt falls through the metal grate, metal meshing, and then any artifact or large stone or scarab or bead or something stays on top. And the process of wet sifting is a way to make sure that the object is seen a lot more effectively and a lot more efficiently. So it's from a pile of discarded dirt. So we actually don't really know exactly where this discarded dirt they say that they can kind of guess, but the reality is they don't know specifically. It's in a pile of discarded dirt. So what does that mean? One of the cardinal rules in archaeological research is context. You document everything. What's the context? What's the stratum? What's the locus? Where is it coming from? All of this stuff is meticulously documented. And the only thing that they can say about this, beyond the shadow of a doubt, is it came from a discard pile.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Which, so right then and there, that restricts the solid conclusions that you can draw from.
Yeah, and I think that's important to point. This is nothing that wasn't found in a stratum. This was something that Zertal dug up, and they went through and found it. So let's talk a little bit about what they're claiming it says. They're claiming this as a cursed tablet, tiny little thing that was a curse was written in, and then it was shut. It was closed shut and basically buried. Right. Let me pull it up here so people can see again what we're talking about. So this is it right here. Very tiny. And this is what they're claiming it says. Now, let me just say before you get into this right here, okay? As a layman, as someone who's got no background in epigraphy and ancient Near Eastern or Israelite archaeology, I looked at this and I was like, this is a hot mess. This is a hot mess. I have bad feelings just looking at this. This doesn't really say anything. And also a lot of what I'm looking at here looks like it's badly inferred. Like if we go back to this, you can see kind of like, well, there are different lines which they're saying are different characters. And you look at it going, how do we know that's not just cracks in the lead? Like this part, it looks like it could just be cracks, but a lot of what they're saying is they're actual characters. And the characters are all different sizes. There's not any sort of order. Is it reading left to right to left, up to down? Like it just doesn't make any sense.
And these are huge flags that you're pointing out to a trained epigraphist. So epigraphy, again, the science of writing. We study writing. So that involves everything from grammar to syntax to what the purported letters look like. Now, there's a lot going into this conversation that your listeners need to understand. The language of Hebrew, okay, the language of Hebrew is something that it wasn't just always there. All right, it's something that develops over time, and it comes from a language that is basically called Proto-Semitic. So the way that you classify a language is by certain features within the text that you're looking at. Okay, so with that being said, you look for certain things that say, okay, Hebrew, we know from the biblical Hebrew language that certain verbs are used, certain nouns are used, certain inflections happen, certain grammatical features appear this way. The thing that they said that they point to that says this is in fact Hebrew is the presence of the divine name. Now, if you question that and you say, I don't even know if the divine name is really there, and there are reasons there, then on what grounds are you saying that this is actually Hebrew? And so if you throw that out, then you have to question what language really is this. And then you get into the letters and why are the letters written the way that they are? Because the reality of it is that there are many different forms for each consonant. So each consonant is written in different ways, which is a big kind of caution. Like, okay, you have to ask yourself the question then, why are they written in different ways? And they give this in the article. So if you actually look at the article, they'll give you different ways in which the same consonant is written. So that's one thing that they don't really answer in the article that you have to ask. That's a question you have to ask, and they need to answer if you are making these claims.
Real
yeah,
quick, I just want to add some context for the audience. This would be like if we found, and I heard David Folk mention this on his channel this morning, Ancient Egypt in the Bible. This would be like if we found an English inscription and like the first letter was regular L, but then the next letter was like a cursive A, and then the next letter was like a capital T, and the next letter was like a lowercase e. It'd be weird, and then like it wouldn't really make a lot of sense. And that's what they're kind of saying is happening in this inscription. That would be crazy. One writer would not do this.
And that's exactly the point. This is something. So a lot of we see on inscriptions different variations with consonants. However, those are usually understood to be indicative of a different hand. Okay, and now I can hear what people are saying. Well, the writer can choose to write in different styles. Yes, he can. That is a possibility. However, it's just not that. It doesn't happen that much. And in many instances, it's better to explain that phenomenon by the presence of multiple authors than say, well, this guy is just changing things here and changing things there, and then he's coming. It just doesn't make a lot of sense. That usually doesn't happen. The other thing is the direction. So in the earliest inscriptions, so Hebrew is normally written from right to left. Okay, that's the standard direction of Hebrew. So it's backwards from English. However, some of the earliest inscriptions that we have, so for instance, the Biblical Sha'arayim Kerbet Kaiapha inscription, that is by many people considered a Hebrew inscription. That's actually written from left to right. So the standardization of right to left order in Hebrew is something that happens over time. And in fact, some of our earliest inscriptions, it's not, the direction isn't even right to left or left to right. It's up to down or something along those lines. However, in all of those cases, the direction is consistent. In this case, it is all over. So I'm not joking. This is the shape, essentially what they argue. It's like that's essentially what it is. And I saw a tweet, I think it was Chris Jones, but I'm not sure who it was. But I just laughed out loud when I saw it because he outlined the direction of the inscription that the authors wanted. And it's all over the place. It was described in the article itself as meandering. Okay. I've never seen an inscription, no matter how early it is, even when the direction is weird, it's always in a predictable direction. There's no prediction. There's no prediction about it whatsoever. So again, these are just things that are odd. They're weird, that need to be explained, that the article doesn't really explain very well. It's as if they didn't think about it. So that's another problem with it. So you have the inconsistency with how the letters are written. You have the inconsistent, unpredictable direction. And and the message that they read on this text it's dictated by that meandering direction. So even if the inscription is meandering but doesn't take the path that they want it to take, then what's it saying?
Exactly. Here's what they're claiming it says. Okay, they're claiming it says, you are cursed by the God Adonai. Cursed. You will die. Cursed. Cursed. You will surely die. Cursed you are by Adonai. Cursed. You will die. Cursed. Cursed. You will surely die. Then they claim it quotes Genesis 6:9. Whoever sheds blood by humans shall their blood be shed. And then apparently they claim it says, what afterlife can one obtain? What can a man obtain hereafter? It's like, they're claiming all of that is in this tiny lead tablet. It's only like, a few centimeters long. And it's taking, as you said, this meandering pattern to get where they want. And mind you, some of these are probably not letters. As you can see what they're claiming.
Right.
A lot of these look like cracks in the lead. So this really just feels like it's coming from their pure and utter imagination. They wanted to say this, and that's what they're doing.
And so this is the other thing. So so the way that this was read through tomographic scans is that they put it through a powerful X-ray machine. And normally when that's the case, and you do these, multiple kind of slides of it at multiple levels, layer upon layer upon layers, taking pictures upon taking pictures, and all of these things are kind of put on top. Normally what you should get is a 3D model as well. that wasn't released. So we don't know. So this is getting at another problem. These may be letters, and there probably are some letters there. We just don't know where those letters are in relationship to everything else. Each one of these letters don't have a context. They're just close-up pictures, and this is all detailed in the article versus your slides. But there are these close-up pictures of these purported letters that, I mean, not only are they unclear, but we don't know where they exist in context with each other. So, and here's the other thing. You can look, if you go back and put that drawing back up on the screen, like the line drawing on one of these publications is never indicative of the reality of the actual artifact. That is to say, the line drawings always make things a lot more clear than what they actually are. So when you take these pictures of these letters and you actually put them side by side with what they're seeing on the X-rays, I'm sorry, I can't see all the letters. I can't see where they get it and where they go, and I can't make the connections that they're connecting. So when you actually look through the article and you say, okay, this is supposed to be a mem, okay, I can see it here. I can't see it over here. This is a yod. Why is this yod written differently? And I don't see it here. Like, how are they getting a yod here? And here's another crazy thing about it. So in this inscription, they claim that there are internal vowels. Okay, so in biblical Hebrew, it is, if your readers don't know, or if your listeners don't know this, it was originally written in consonants only. There were no vowels. It was just consonants. The vowel points are a later addition by a group of people, a group of scribes called the Masoretes. Now, before the Masoretes came in and put all the vowel pointings underneath the consonants, early on in the development of the language, they would use certain consonants as vowels. They were called matres lectionis, mothers of reading in the Latin. And they would help people understand what form it was. So they would help the pronunciation, help the reading. However, they have a vav, which it does function as a matres lectionis in biblical Hebrew, but they have a vav in this inscription on multiple occasions as a matres lectionis. If you take this out, the earliest example of an internal vav functioning as a vowel in a Hebrew inscription is from Iron II. It is about 500 years later. It's in the Silwan tomb inscription. No, I'm sorry, not the Silwan tomb inscription. The Siloam tomb inscription, and it's the same word. It's arur. It's cursed be, and so it's likely pointed as a call passive participle. But they have an internal matres lectionis in these inscriptions on multiple occasions. So if that is indeed the case, not only is it incredibly unique, being the earliest example of an internal matres lectionis, but it turns on the head our understanding on how those things developed. Now, they address this very, very briefly and very, very indirectly in their article, and they make an appeal to Ugaritic, which is what it is, I guess. It's not very strong of an argument, but that's another crazy thing about their reading. They're putting in grammatical and phonological features that otherwise don't happen until like 500, 600 years later.
Yeah, for people that want to make a comparison here, this would be like claiming you found an inscription from the time of Alfred the Great that had words that Shakespeare invented. It just would be a little off, and we'd go, okay, maybe this really wasn't the case. So can you sum up the whole problem with this inscription? Like, is this, and like, what is going on? Is this a disaster? Because it really comes across as if it's a disaster for them.
So it was interesting. When you approached me initially, and you said, I can't remember what you said on your Twitter blurb to kind of tell everybody this was happening. I think you said something like, "Is there anything there?" I can't remember exactly your wording, but here's the thing: it's a mess. And there are a lot of things that they have to explain, and they don't do a good job explaining. I think twofold the issues with this is, one, the journal article. There are serious questions about how rigorous this peer review process was. I don't think that we can go too far with questioning the journal and questioning the peer review process. That's taking things to a whole different level. Although it still is really odd that this is published in Heritage Science. The other thing, which is, I think, more of a legitimate criticism, is the quality of their argument. The paleographic analysis on which this argument it rests is really shaky. There are a lot of questions, from why are there internal matres lectiones there? Why are the letters so inconsistently written? What about that meandering direction of this inscription? Why are there not 3D pictures, better pictures? How are you seeing the consonants? So the paleographic analysis, the argumentation, if you will, really has some work to do. So that's essentially what it is. The journal, which isn't really the biggest issue in my opinion, but the paleographic analysis, that is a problem. Now, is there something there? Probably. There's something here. I just don't know what it is. And I'm extremely skeptical that it's the inscription that they actually say that it is. Because you're exactly right. This is lead. This is a soft metal. I mean, some of these things, indentations, what is it to say that that's not a rock sitting on this lead tablet for hundreds of years that are making these indentations? And what about creases? And what about shadows? This is, again, we need higher resolution photos. There has to be more that's released. And there are serious questions that have arisen from the initial publication that have to be dealt with.
So do you think this is actually a cursed tablet found on Mount Ebal? It's just we can't read it right now.
I think it's something. Now the problem is the only way that it becomes a cursed tablet is if you translate the word cursed be in the inscription. And I've already mentioned that's a problem because you supposedly have an internal vowel that otherwise isn't there yet. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if it's a cursed tablet. I think there's something there. I think something's probably written on it. I think there's enough evidence to say that there are some discernible letters there, but isn't this sophisticated, chiastic, elaborate curse statement, curse ritual that they suggested is, I'm just not sold on that.
Yeah. And I think that is the position I hope my followers will take. This is definitely something. They found something, but because they went through this weird process and they made this ridiculous translation, they claim this is what it says. This is just, it's not coming across as this really interesting find that it should have been. You know?
And that's the tragedy in this. Look, I am all for the historical veracity of Scripture. I am its biggest advocate, and I wish that something like this could be found, because I think Ebal is a great site. I think there's a lot that's at stake at Mount Ebal. I think Zertal was right. As I tell my students, if it walks like a duck, quacks like a duck, and looks like a duck, it's probably a duck. So despite what people like William Deaver say, I think that was a cultic site on Mount Ebal. So I think that this is a really, really neat and important site that we have to understand. And this is a really, really potentially neat find. It's just been not put forth in the public eye in the proper way.
Exactly. And that needs to be pointed out here. There is something good here. It's just not been handled by the right people in the right way. And hopefully something good does come out of this. As I mentioned, this is the site that Zertal dug at. That is, I believe right now, majority of scholars have sort of gone in the direction of Zertal and said that, yes, this is a cultic site. I'm not sure if that's true or not, though.
So the backstory on that is there was a huge uproar in the 70s and 80s when Zertal came out and said, this is an altar, and we need, if this is an altar that's dated to the time when the settlement would have been, we need to ask some interesting questions. Zertal initially was not as adamant that in fact this could be Joshua's altar. If I am understanding the story correctly, I think he eventually kind of shifts there and basically says, I think this could be it. But he wasn't initially as adamant. Now, that was not received well. People like Aaron Kopensky said, no, absolutely not. This is not a cultic site. This is a watchtower. Bill Deaver, tongue-in-cheek, said, no, this isn't a cultic site. It's an Iron Age barbecue. Now, he didn't really mean that, but he didn't want to go to the cult site. Ralph Hawkins actually wrote his dissertation on how to classify what we see on Mount Ebal. And he makes a comparative argument. And I would actually say that more people are open to the cultic interpretation now, but there's still a lot of debate on whether or not we should understand this site cultically. But in my opinion, you're dealing with, I talk at length about this in my first book, Pondering the Spade. There's a lot of things that point us to the direction of this is probably a cultic site. So that's why I say if it walks like a duck, quacks like a duck, and looks like a duck, it's probably a duck.
Yeah, it seems to fit well. We just can't say for sure what it is. But I mean, like, again, it's not like a deal breaker, I would say, at the end of the day. But it is an interesting site. Dates to the time that the conquest would line up with, which is just before the end of the Bronze Age, around 1200 BC, I believe it. Is there anything else you want to say about the Mount Ebal site? Anything else about the inscription? Again, as for everyone is aware, again, we wish this little curse tablet was what the archaeologists who found it said it was. The problem is there's just so many problems, as we mentioned here. This is just a mess, and we need to come out and basically tell people what's really going on here, not try to hide it or go along with sensationalist reports. This is not something we should be, falling for.
Yeah, as I said, I'm less convinced now than I was after, and the press conference, in my opinion, was the way not to do this. A year ago, I pointed my students to this, and I basically said, this is not how you do this. Everything that they did, you want to do basically the opposite. And again, the Beneath the Bible guys on YouTube, they did an excellent presentation with everything wrong with the press conference. This actually lowers my confidence level even more, because when I read this article, there are more questions that I have about the paleographic analysis more than anything else. I mean, it's really frustrating, particularly as somebody who considers themselves an evangelical, who considers themselves as having a quote unquote high view of Scripture, that pursues the tough historical questions, particularly about the Old Testament, realizing that these are complicated questions that require a lot of nuance. That's who I am. And to see this, I'm really disappointed.
Yeah, I am too as well. I was hoping they may have found something, and they just got lucky. But I mean, like, oh boy, this is not it, guys. Unfortunately, but I do want to talk about something else here. For example, this is Dr. Schreiner's book that he just came out with. Really great book. If you want some good scholarship in light of all this mess that's happening around us right now, I highly recommend you get your book here, which has an amazing title, I might say, Ahab's House of Horror, where you go through a lot of the history of the Omrid dynasty and their battles. And this is a very interesting book. I definitely enjoyed it.
Yeah, well, I'm glad to hear that. Yeah, that was the title. Everybody's like, how'd you come up with the title? Well, the editors came up with the title, actually. Well, our title that my co-author and I, Dr. Kyle Greenwood, he's a fellow alum of Asbury Theological Seminary, and we got together and we started work on this. But our actual original title was very boring and scholarly. It's actually preserved in the subtitle there. But the marketing people at Lexham Press were like, that's not going to work. We need something more catchy. So we went through some different things. But no, this book was fun. It was fun to write. It very much deals with a complicated historical question that is a perpetual question when it comes to the Omride dynasty. And essentially what it is this. The picture of the relative weakness of Ahab and his family, the relative military weakness vis-a-vis the Arameans in 1 Kings chapter 20, 1 Kings chapter 22, and 2 Kings 3 does not match with the larger historical evidence of how resourceful and how powerful the Omride dynasty was. And so this creates a question. What's going on here? Is the Bible being less than truthful? Is it being inaccurate? And many critical scholars, and I consider myself a critical scholar because I look at the Old Testament critically, asking hard historical questions. But many scholars would say that the picture that you have in these chapters is actually from a later time period when Israel was in fact weaker than the Arameans, about 100 years later. And it's been put back there associated with Ahab because we don't like Ahab in the Old Testament, because Ahab is the quintessential anti-Yahwistic villain. And, Mount Carmel, let's in Queen Jezebel, let's kill all the prophets of Yahweh, etc. And what they point to in those chapters is the fact that Ahab is not really mentioned. It's King of Israel, King of Israel, King of Israel, King of Israel. And so it's this animization going on here. And so they say, okay, see, in these chapters, Ahab's not really mentioned. It's just King of Israel, King of Israel, King of Israel. And supposedly Ahab's is really weak in these chapters. So it can't be Ahab, because we have the Assyrian records that talk about how great Ahab is and how much military force he had. So Kyle and I said, no. Let's actually stop and rethink this. Let's not be so quick to say, oh, it's from a later time period that's been brought forward, applied to Ahab because we just don't like Ahab. So one thing led to another, and we asked ourselves the question, this animization, this constant reference to King of Israel, King of Israel, King of Israel, is it actually something rhetorical? And that's the conclusion that we came to. It's a part of the historiographic presentation that says we at this moment are going to focus not on Ahab, not on his descendants, but rather the institution of the king, particularly how they did business. And that is what we are going to criticize. So essentially, that's what it was. And it becomes a study on how the biblical writers wrote history. So it's dealing with a very complicated historical question that tries to get at in a way that takes seriously the extra biblical evidence as well as the Old Testament's ability to write history.
Awesome. So I want to talk to you about something in the book. For anyone listening right now, if you have questions, we're going to go to the Q&A here in a minute here. So if you've got questions about the Mount Ebal curse tablet, about Mount Ebal itself, about anything in his book regarding Second Kings, I believe is where you focus mostly on. End of First Kings.
No, First Kings. End of First Kings, beginning of Second Kings.
Yeah. So we connected it because we both ended up using the same scholar. I did one for a video you mentioned in my book, Drew Holland. When I did a video on 2 Kings 3, and was the God of Israel defeated by the Moabite god Chemosh. So that's how you have a great chapter on this as well. But I do want to talk about one thing. You talk about this historical tension between kings and some of the historical records. So let's go to the Tel Dan stealing, which is a very important inscription that was found, mentions House of David on it. So we have an early inscription for David on there. But talk about the historical tension this actually creates with kings, and then talk a little bit about your solution that you come from the book. Because one thing I do like about in your book is you mention multiple different scholarly takes on it, and then you offer criticisms. You just don't go with like the quickest one that it's going to quickly solve the issue and move on. You entertain different possibilities and you respond to them. So I think that's great. So dive into that a little bit. Talk about what's in the book.
Right. So the Tel Dan inscription is known for being one of the earliest references to King David. And then the fact it makes a specific reference to Beit Dawid, the House of David. So if we're going to be really, really precise, it's a reference to the Davidic dynasty, which then indirectly gives historical credence to King David, because you can't have the House of David without there being an actual David. So that's what it's most known for. However, in our conversation, this becomes important because the Tel Dan Stela is written in Aramaic. It's not a Hebrew inscription. It's not from Israel. It's actually written by some Aramean king. Now, we don't know who it was written by because the name's not there. We found the Tel Dan inscription, or to the Tel Dan Stela, because it had been shattered, because this is what you do when you overtake a city from a previous king. You take all their monumental inscriptions and you shatter them and you break them because you don't want their presence to stand. You want to kind of give away this certain perception of how powerful you are, etc. So the Israelites overtook Dan after Aramean control, and they shattered this inscription, which was an Aramaic inscription, probably written by a guy named Hazael, and they used it as pavement, essentially is what they did. And that's how we found it. We found it in secondary usage. So this becomes important because on this inscription, it's written by an Aramean king that claims to have killed off the Omride dynasty. Now, this is a problem because you have an Aramaic inscription saying probably there's some historical some linguistic reconstruction, but everybody's fairly in consensus here, that you have an Aramean king claiming to have offed the Omride dynasty. And yet in the Bible, you have King Jehu, who is an Israelite usurper, an Israelite general initially, that gets the go-ahead from the Yahweh's prophet. And according to the Bible, he's the one who facilitates the downfall and is responsible for the fall of the Amorite dynasty. So you can see the problem. And the Bible makes a claim that it's Jehu, and yet you have this Aramaic inscription that claims it's this Aramean king, probably King Hazael, who's actually the person responsible for taking down the Amorite dynasty. So basically, who you got? Are you on Team Bible or are you on Team Aramaic inscription? And this is the conundrum. So in our conversation, knowing full well what type of literature, so genre becomes important here, knowing the type of literature and knowing how ancient kings wrote this type of literature, we realized there's some literary stretching going on here. There's some kind of hyperbole, there's some rhetoric. And so what we found, and the argument that we make, is that they're actually both right. And they are doing what ancient kings did and making these bombastic claims, stretching the truth a little bit, exploiting the semantic ambiguity, and they're both making claim to being responsible for the downfall of the Amorite dynasty. And what we think happened is that there were multiple mechanisms that brought down this Amorite dynasty. If the Amorite dynasty was as resourceful and powerful as everybody claims it was, it's highly improbable that a singular issue or a singular mechanism brought this dynasty down. It probably was the confluence of multiple factors bringing this dynasty down. So it's quite possible in our mind that the Arameans were working in cahoots with this general usurper and kind of coordinated some things, and they can both therefore make the claim that yes, it was in fact, I'm the one who did it. And we center in on a particular verb that's used in the biblical record. And it's a really interesting verb because it's usually used with a certain nuance, and it's not here. And Kyle and I basically make the suggestion that the biblical writer, because this is ancient history writing, is exploiting the semantic ambiguity to, on the one hand, say, yes, we are being truthful, we're not making stuff up, but we're making sure that the reader understands the point that we are trying to communicate.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a great way to put it. And again, if you want more, fuller detail on some of these issues and how they're resolved, I highly recommend this book. I thoroughly enjoyed it. And it's a short read. I think I read it on a plane ride back from Fort Worth recently. So I definitely appreciate that. So I got a question here for you from the audience. Let me put this up here. So thank you for the super chat. Does this put any weight behind the early date? I think he is referring to the curse amulet because in the article, let's just put this up. The article, they claim that this is evidence for the early date of the Exodus. Now, for those who don't know, typically scholars believe the Exodus conquest, if it happened, would have happened in the 1200s. So just before the Bronze Age collapse. Early date proponents like Scott Stripling, one of the main authors behind this article on the curse tablet, as well as Associates for Biblical Research, they want to move that back about 200 years. They want to say Exodus conquest happened in the 1400s BC. So they're claiming this amulet is somehow evidence for the early date. I'm not sure that's the case. What do you have to say on that?
So there's two parties, and particularly most non-evangelicals will side with what's called the late date of the Exodus and the late date of settlement, and so they'll put it at the middle or the end of the 13th century, so about 1250-ish is normally what they will. For evangelicals, it's one of two options. It's either an early date, which is about 1450-ish, 15th century, and then the late date, which is about 13th century, about 1250-ish. The problem with this being evidence for an early date is that you have to adjust the chronology of Mount Ebal. So one of the good things about Mount Ebal is that we know that it was only occupied for a relative short period of time. Okay, nobody disagrees with this. Where the disagreement comes into play is how you basically, when did it start and when did it end? There are two main phases of existence at Mount Ebal. So the first phase is when the site, let's just call it a cultic site for the sake of this discussion. It was very plain. It was very underdeveloped. Early Iron Age, this is expanded, this is updated, this is upgraded, and it becomes this whole new beast, whole new animal. Much more activity was going on. So most people will put this at the end of the late Bronze Age into the early Iron Age. That's what most people date this. So if this tablet is in fact evidence of an early date, then you are adjusting that chronological spectrum. So in my opinion, no, I do not think that this tablet is great support for an early date of the Exodus. I know Scott Stripling argues for that, and this is one of the great implications that he draws from his conclusion, or from his research. And this is also one of the things that is criticized, that is questioned, essentially saying, how can you take this and then go all the way over here and make this elaborate argument for an early date of the Exodus? I'm not the only person that questions that, but no, in my opinion, I don't think that this puts too much weight behind an early date of the Exodus. If you're going to hold to that, you got to make it on from a different angle.
Yeah, I think you're right. I would totally agree with you. This is they're really stretching credulity here when they say they found evidence for an early date of the Exodus. Anytime I've looked more into this when I've been corrected by scholars in the past, all the evidence seems to point more and more to the late date for the Exodus, not the early date, and this does not help the early date at all.
No, for it to help the early date, you have to adjust the chronology of the Ebal site.
Yeah,
that's the issue, and that becomes very, very problematic.
Right. I got another question here from Addison. Thank you for the super chat here. I see your book is part of a series. Can we expect more books in this series? If so, when? Because we need more books on Old Testament reliability that are A, high quality, and B, accessible to laymen.
That's a great question. I don't have the answer to that. The editors would have the answer to that. However, I will tell you that there was one previous volume. Hang on.
Go for it.
I have it on my shelf. There's one previous volume that is Where Was the Biblical Red Sea? Is written by a guy named Barry Beitzel, and he actually is the series editor. So ours is the second book in the series. I do not know how many books they have going into the series, but this is a series that is kind of doing what we did in that book, that tackles an important historical question and engages the necessary nuance.
Mm-hmm. I appreciate that. Yeah, we'd like to see more, so it's always good to see that. Here's a interesting question related to your book. Does the Bible say that those who escape the hand of Jehu will fall into the hands of Hazael?
Yeah, I'm supposed to know this exactly, but there is a yes. So there is a recognition, and this kind of comes from the prophet that kind of laments Hazael, and so there is a kind of this scene where the prophet, I believe it's Elisha, but I may be misremembering at this point. Where he's basically lamenting the fact that Hazael is going to come to the throne, and what does this mean for Israel and all the problems that are going to have. So there is a statement there in First Kings. I can't remember exactly where it is. It could be Second Kings. That is it. So the Bible is aware of Hazael. They are aware of the problems that Hazael is going to kind of represent for God's people, particularly the Northern Kingdom, and there is some lamenting going on. Yes. So I think the specific statement is those who escape the hands of Jehu. Yeah. So I want to say it does somewhere, and I know I should know this off the top of my head, but that question caught me a little bit off guard. But it does lament Hazael and what he is going to represent for Israel.
Yeah. Here's a little pushback from a critic at Pairs in the audience. He says it seems the academics are quick to want to dismiss this Mount Ebal age Torah portion. I think he's referring to the portion in the article that was published that seems to quote from, they're claiming quotes from Genesis.
No, I mean, okay. I mean, the question is, does it actually say that? I mean, this is a big problem here. This is the crux of the problem. Does the inscription, if it even is an inscription, now I think it's something, okay? Now, but the question is does this actually say what they say it says? And that's the problem. This is the problem. I don't know what letters they see. They say they know what letters they see, but based on the pictures that I see, it doesn't necessarily jive with the drawings. So I can't even begin to answer the question, does this actually quote Genesis, or does this allude to some sort of Torah consciousness? I don't even know, because I'm not convinced that this thing says what it says. They say it says. So again, it's not us being overly dismissive. It's not us saying, well, poo-poo on them. This is us merely asking legitimate questions to say that are saying we don't really see what you say we're seeing. And until we see better, higher resolution pictures, until you explain these other issues, we can't make the jumps that you are willing to make.
Yeah. Real quick, it seems I misunderstood them here. They're not saying this is in the inscription. They're saying that it's a similar chiastic parallel. So that's what they're claiming. And, they're claiming this. That was my mistake. So it appears they're claiming that it's like that. And they're claiming this is a problem for the documentary hypothesis. Look, I'll note there are many problems with the documentary hypothesis. This is not one of them.
Yeah, this is not one of them. Look, I've written on the documentary hypothesis with my mentor, my PhD mentor, Dr. Bill Arnold. We've written an article on it. And look, the documentary hypothesis, one, no one believes in the classical articulation of the documentary hypothesis anymore. That's just, no one believes that Wellhausen was right. I mean, there's the classic statement that says, Wellhausen came out with this theory at the exact moment and that it could have been. In other words, if he would have come out with his thesis 10 years later, it wouldn't have caught traction. So it happened at the right time, and no one buys into the Wellhausian articulation anymore. Now, that isn't to say that there aren't sources behind the Pentateuch, there aren't sources behind your Old Testament. But these are complicated arguments built on good evidence, built on good comparative parallels, built on circumstantial evidence, yes, but good circumstantial evidence. And to say that this thing blows all of that up, I'm sorry, it's wishful thinking, because the idea of sources behind your Old Testament text is way more than what this particular tablet, even if it says what they say it says, it's not going to take that away. Because these are realities that are built on other things and other lines of argumentation that this article and this tablet does not touch.
Yeah. So I think we got one more question here, and then we can close it out. Do you plan on writing more books related to Old Testament reliability?
I've got a lot of plans to write a lot of books. Yeah, I mean, look, this is kind of my wheelhouse. I'm a big advocate. The historical books in the Old Testament have been the texts that I have constantly gone to growing up. I'm a pastor's kid, so I grew up going to church. I grew up reading the Bible, and the stories of 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, Joshua and Judges. Those are the passages that I have always loved. And when I started going to seminary, and I realized the neat conversations and the issues of archaeology and the issues of historical reconstruction, I just fell in love with this stuff even more. So that's kind of my wheelhouse. Look, this is a serious question. History matters. Look, we are a faith. Christianity is a faith that rises and falls on certain historical realities. First Corinthians chapter 15, in my opinion, puts that beyond question. However, that isn't to say that these things are not easy. Okay, that isn't to say, that isn't to say these questions are easy, because they're not, and they're complicated, and it's hard. And so I am all for looking into the potential historical reliability of the Old Testament. And the more that I do this, the more I'm convinced of it. However, they're not simple conversations. So yeah, I mean, I will settle into this because this is my wheelhouse. I don't know exactly where it is. I have a book coming out with a friend of mine, actually Drew Holland, that you've mentioned earlier.
Wow.
We're getting ready to publish a book together that is a very comparative book. So we read portions of the Old Testament in conjunction with like texts from other cultures. And so we do a comparative reading of the Old Testament. What do these comparisons mean? What is that? How does this help us understand the nuances of the Old Testament, et cetera, et cetera? That's actually in the production phase right now. We're going through editorial edits. That'll probably be out later this year. That's going to be a little bit more technical. But yeah, I don't know exactly where it is. I've got some ideas. I'm a big warfare guy too. So yeah, we'll see. We'll see where it goes.
Yeah, I do like it. I really did enjoy Drew Holland's book. And as you see, this was the video I did about 4 months ago, was Adonai defeated by another god, and goes into his article on 2 Kings 3, which I thought was phenomenal. You reference him in his book. And I think it's great that you said that, you the more you study, the more you find confidence in the Bible, because I have found the same thing as well. But I just want to tell everyone, when we're looking for evidence to support the Bible, this ain't it. This is riddled with problems right here, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, who knows? Look, I'm all for redemption, and I think but the path for redemption is set. There are questions and look, I'm not the only person saying this. All you have to do is peruse Twitter. I'm not the only person saying this. And people like Chris Ralston, Robert Cargill, they're mean. I mean, they're just going after these people. And in a sense, I get it. I understand why they're upset. I understand why they're frustrated. But the path for redemption has been laid out for the authors of this article. If they want to be taken seriously, they have to answer these questions. And I'm only scratching the surface on these questions. And this isn't just me being a wet blanket. I'm just kind of, I'm just kind of channeling what a lot of other people are saying. And honestly, these are criticisms that I back and I believe in, and I think are legitimate criticisms. Look, if we are going to take the line of being advocates for the historical reliability and trustworthiness of Scripture, we have got to do the hard work. Mm-hmm. And when things are raised, and when things are pointed out, this is myself included. Look, I mean, I write this stuff. I open myself up to criticism as well. If I am not willing to answer these issues, why? I mean, why am I doing this? So the path for redemption is laid out. They've got to take it.
Yeah. And I think that I like the way you said it. There is a path for redemption. They need to come to terms with a lot of the things made. I think you're right. This is something. This little tiny tablet is something, but it just, unfortunately, the way they've gone about announcing this, it's just turned it into a laughing stock, and they've not presented it in the right way. It would have made so much more sense if they would have said, "We found this little amulet that's led on Mount Ebal. We need more help trying to study and figure it out." But they didn't do that, and that's really unfortunate. And this is really just—it's something that could have been really exciting, really interesting, and they turned it into a blender, unfortunately.
It's disappointing. It's disappointing.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I'm in full agreement with you on this whole thing right here. I don't think you've said anything in the stream that I really disagree with. So yeah, I really appreciate you coming on my channel, talking about your book, talking about this new recent article that was published. So again, guys, let me just put this up here for you guys again one more time. This is the article right here. That was just recently published on Mount Ebal. This is type of scholarship you want to stay away from, and this is the type of scholarship you want to focus on right here. So compare and contrast. This is what I want to do today. Focus on bad scholarship and then good scholarship here. And that's why I appreciate Dr. Schreiner coming on, talking about his book, helping us address this thing and not leading Christians down this sensationalist road where we just believe anything we want because it supports our worldview. We need to be critical of our own worldview, critical of evidence that could be used to help it, and not just fall for any sort of sensationalist report out there. So Dr. Schreiner, thank you for coming on the channel today. Anything you want to let people know about yourself, upcoming works, where they can see more of what you do? If you want to talk about any upcoming books, you're more than welcome to.
No, I appreciate it. I appreciate coming on, chit-chatting about this. I think it's a really important conversation. Look, it's, again, I'm passionate about this stuff. I consider myself an evangelical. I have a high view of Scripture, and I just, we just have to be aware of certain things, and we have to be willing to do the hard work. And I fear that this article, like I said, it raises more questions, and there are questions that need to be answered. But we fight the good fight. The questions that challenge the historical veracity of Scripture and the historical truthfulness of Scripture, they're perpetual. We just have to be willing to engage it in a good way. So, no, you can check us out, wbs.edu. That's the school I work for. And like I said, we're a seminary in the Wesleyan Arminian tradition, and we're an independent standing seminary. We've been around since 1974. So we're coming up on about 50 years. I've been there for a few years. But we emphasize biblical studies and theology and biblical theology and those sorts of things. So if you have any questions, you can reach me through that website, and but wbs.edu.
Appreciate it. Thanks for coming. Thanks for listening, everyone, and we'll catch you next time. All right. I believe we are, hold on.